The day I realised my ledger said enough while the men in the line said not enough, I understood something was being stolen in silence. Every page I turned pointed back to the same battalion, the same colonel, while my superiors told me to keep the numbers tidy and move on. So I began copying the figures by lamplight, one quiet act against a system that preferred missing rations to awkward questions. When the inspectors finally opened my envelope, I watched their eyes move over the theft my pencil had uncovered, and waited to see whom the silence would protect. In the winter of 1944 on the Italian front, an Allied infantry division held a damp, exhausted line north of the Garigliano River. The front shifted slowly, if at all. Men in muddy trenches measured time by incoming shells stand to at dawn, and the arrival or absence of hot food. Several miles to the rear, along a road cut deep with ruts and filled with water, the division's supply depot sat in a shallow valley. From a distance it looked like an untidy market, canvas tents sagging under rain, piles of wooden crates, fuel drums stacked in uneven towers, trucks parked at angles in churned mud. Closer in, it was a world run by forms, signatures and numbers. In one low hut, built from rough timber and covered with corrugated iron, a single kerosene lamp hung over a scarred wooden desk. The light pooled onto open ledgers, the smell of paraffin mixing with damp paper and wet wool. At that desk sat a stores clerk from the quartermaster section, thin-faced, wearing round spectacles that slid down his nose when he bent over the pages. He had come to the division not as a fighting man, but as someone who understood columns and regulations. A medical issue had kept him from frontline duty. Instead of a rifle, he carried a pencil, a rubber, and a battered slide rule. His war lived inside the ledger. Shipments received, rations issued, signatures collected. Each morning began the same way. Railhead receipts arrived from higher depots, reporting how many tons of flour, meat, biscuits, tea, sugar, and fresh produce had been consigned to the division. Beside those figures, he entered what left the depot for brigades, then battalions, then sometimes individual companies when special demands came through. He had been trained to trust the system. Ration strength returns came from the units each day, listing how many mouths required feeding. The principle was simple. Count the men, consult the scale, issue the food. Outside the hut, rain fell almost continuously. Mud swallowed boots, trucks strained and stalled, mules slipped on steep tracks. The clerk rarely stepped beyond the depot yard, but he saw the consequences splashed across uniforms, heard the curses of drivers when they slid sideways into ditches, and watched men scrape clotted mud from their trousers before stepping into the office. Rumours of hunger at the front reached him in fragments. A quartermaster sergeant mentioned that men were cutting their bread thinner. A medic passing through spoke of tired faces, loosened belts, and men who seemed older than they had a month before. Letters from the line, when they were read aloud in the mess, included casual complaints about thin stew and empty tins, on paper, that the division was not starving. The deliveries recorded from the railhead matched the allocation for its official strength. Each day the ledger showed that sufficient rations arrived and were issued. He told himself at first that war always bent numbers. Loads were lost to shelling. Trucks broke down, bridges collapsed, roads became impassable. Some of what left the depot simply never made it to the men it was meant for. But the ledger did not forget. As days turned into weeks, the clerk began to notice that certain entries did not just reflect the chaos of war. They formed patterns. He saw one infantry battalion whose recorded ration strength had fallen after casualties, yet whose daily issues of food had quietly grown. He underlined the relevant figures with his eyes, not his pencil. The battalion belonged to the division's senior brigade and held a stretch of line near a key road junction. Its commander, a colonel known for driving his men hard and for his presence at the front, was mentioned often enough in the mess. The colonel occasionally visited the depot, arriving in a staff car splashed with road grime. He spoke with the divisional quartermaster in low tones among the stacks of crates, glanced over the yard and departed again. He rarely, if ever, stepped into the ledger hut. The clerk, sitting at his desk, saw only glimpses. A heavy coat, a peaked cap, boots marked with the dry mud rather than the wet, clinging kind from trenches. It was not resentment he felt, but distance. His world was the space between the lamp and the ledger. The colonel's world was the space between orders and the front line. Still, the numbers kept returning to him. When he added up the issues to that battalion over a fortnight and compared them to its ration strength returns, the difference was too large to dismiss. He brought this to his immediate superior, a warrant officer with years of service and a weary acceptance of how things worked. The warrant officer listened, lit a cigarette, and squinted at the ledger. He suggested that the battalion might be feeding attached units, pioneers, mule drivers, local labour. Paperwork, he said, often lagged behind reality. The clerk nodded, but the unease did not leave him. He knew that attached units existed, but he also knew how they were supposed to be recorded. If more mouths were being fed, they should appear somewhere in the returns. The gaps on the page remained. Quietly, he changed his own routine. At night, when the depot grew still and the lamp's flame seemed loud in the silence, he opened a separate notebook. There he copied by hand the dates, unit names, ration strengths, and issues that troubled him. He did not think of it as an accusation. At first, it was simply a way to see clearly, to strip the clutter away and isolate the pattern. But as the pages filled, it became something more, a private record that preserved what the main ledger might later lose. The weather worsened. Battalion ration parties arrived late, shivering, faces drawn, boots soaked through. Some sergeants came into the hut to sign for their loads and lingered a moment longer than necessary. One evening, a quartermaster sergeant from a hard-hit battalion stood at the desk, cap in hand, shoulders slightly stooped. He signed the form, then mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his men had been on reduced portions for 2 days. The extra rations promised after a previous shortfall had not arrived. The clerk checked the ledger and read back the official story. According to the records, the battalion had received everything due. The sergeant listened with a tired half-smile, then replied that the trucks might have gone elsewhere. He did not say where. He simply tapped his fingers once on the desk and left. Outside, the rain hammered on the roof. Inside, the clerk looked again at the numbers and felt something tighten in his chest. There was, he realised, a gap between the war his figures described and the war those men were living. He began to look beyond the ration entries. He asked the transport section, under the pretext of checking fuel consumption, for a list of truck movements on certain days. Those records showed that vehicles carrying rations sometimes paused at points not listed on formal routes. Drivers, if asked in the right tone, admitted that they made occasional stops in small towns and villages. There, intermediaries waited. Locals who understood supply patterns and had connections to markets. In those places, crates could be exchanged for currency, jewellery, or promises. Such leaks were not unique to that front or that division. He had heard talk of similar things happening in North Africa and elsewhere, always in the spaces where oversight thinned. But the volume here, it seemed, went beyond what could be dismissed as the usual seepage of war. The clerk's anxiety grew not as a sudden fear, but as a constant presence. He still ate his own rations at the depot mess. Still filled his cup with weak tea, still wrote letters home describing the monotony of his work without mentioning the details. Yet whenever he tried to sleep, he saw columns of figures marching past him, splitting and rejoining, some vanishing altogether. At the same time, the divisional medical officer was recording his own set of numbers. He saw men admitted to aid posts with persistent fatigue, weight loss, slow-healing wounds. In his reports, he began to note that these trends might be linked to insufficient nourishment. Their worlds intersected one evening near the divisional headquarters mess. The clerk, carrying the ledger, waited in a corridor for a routine conference. The medical officer, holding a folder of case notes, waited for another meeting. They exchanged brief formal greetings. The third medical officer's eyes dropped to the ledger, and he remarked that supply figures must make for heavy reading. The clerk answered that they were necessary, then hesitated and added quietly that some of the numbers did not seem to match what he was hearing from the line. The medical officer did not react with surprise. He simply said that his records showed similar misalignment between what ought to be happening and what was. He asked with care whether the clerk might look at patterns across units, not just totals. They parted without forming a plan. Both understood the limits of their roles and the risk of pushing too hard. But from that moment, the clerk felt less alone in what he had seen. The weeks that followed brought more complaints up the chain. The company officers sent notes saying their men were always at the edge of shortage. Some wrote that they had to rearrange patrols and work details because their hunger was grinding down endurance. Eventually, these reports reached the divisional commander. An internal inspection was ordered, phrased as a routine review of supply arrangements under difficult conditions. Officially, the aim was to identify bottlenecks and logistical challenges. At the depot, this news brought a familiar tightening of nerves. Officers checked their files. The warrant officer reminded the clerk that any minor discrepancies should be regularized before outsiders arrived. It was important, he said, that the division appear efficient and well run. The clerk heard the warning behind the words, and he knew that regularizing might mean smoothing figures until the ledger told a simple, flattering story. He returned to his separate notebook and realized that he now stood between two versions of the war, the adjusted one and the difficult one. The night before the inspection, the colonel whose battalion dominated the worrying entries walked into the ledger hut. It was unusual, his visits normally ended in the yard or at the quartermaster's office. He closed the door behind him, removed his gloves, and asked to see the ration book. The clerk handed it over, his hand steady, his mouth dry. The colonel flipped through the pages, pausing here and there, saying little. After a minute, he closed the ledger and set it on the desk. He spoke in a calm, even tone about the pressures on commanders. Men, he said. They needed to be fed if they were to fight. If rations failed, morale collapsed, and units ceased to function. Any suggestion that a battalion was misusing supplies would be, in his words, unfortunate in the present climate. The statement was not a direct threat. It did not need to be. The clerk understood that if questions were asked, those at the top had many ways to deflect blame onto those who kept the books. After the colonel left, the hut felt smaller. The lamp's light seemed harsher on the ledger's pages. The clerk sat for a long time, hands folded, listening to the rain on the roof before opening his notebook again. In that moment, the quiet decision he had been approaching for weeks became clear. He could adjust the ledger and remove the most obvious irregularities, protecting himself and preserving the colonel's position. Or he could preserve the discrepancies and make it harder for them to be explained away. He chose a third path. He opened a fresh sheaf of paper and wrote out a condensed summary. Dates, units, ration strengths, issues, and the differences that could not easily be explained. He added a short note describing how the figures were taken directly from the official ledger, without alteration. He did not use the word theft. He did not accuse. He simply described the gap between what the division was supposed to be issuing and what certain units recorded as their strength. He folded the pages, placed them in an envelope, and addressed it to the corps-level supply inspector scheduled to oversee the inquiry. The act felt both trivial and enormous, like placing a single stone into a current that might carry it away or might, over time, shift the flow. When the inspection team arrived the next day, they brought out with them the usual mixture of thoroughness and formality. They examined storage tents, fuel depots, vehicle pools. They asked about spoilage, about enemy action, about delays on narrow mountain roads. Eventually they came to the ledger hut. The senior inspector, a major with a background in logistics, asked to see the ration records. The clerk placed the thick ledger on the table, its spine creaking slightly as it opened. The questions began predictably. How were issues recorded? How were returns handled? How did the depot account for losses? The clerk answered carefully, describing routines that had become almost automatic to him. Then the medical officer presented his own data. He spoke of trends in weight loss, illness, and recovery times, linking them not to individual complaints but to a pattern consistent with underfeeding. He did not point a finger, but he made it clear that something in the supply chain was failing. The inspector turned back to the ledger and asked a different kind of question. Were there units whose recorded ration strength did not align with their issues over time? The clerk, heart beating faster, said that there were. He showed them the entries for the colonel's battalion. He pointed out that according to the returns, the battalion had shrunk after casualties, yet its issues had grown. He then indicated other units whose men were known to be complaining of shortages, yet whose allocations remained modest. The colonel was present in the hut, standing slightly apart but close enough to hear. He explained that his unit had, at various times, been ordered to feed attached engineering parties, mule trains and labour columns. Paperwork, he said, could not always keep pace with operational demands. The inspector noted the explanation and asked for supporting documents. Orders, amended returns, additional ration strength forms. Few were produced. Some were said to have been lost when a truck was hit. Others, officers claimed, had simply never arrived from the front. At that point, the clerk produced the sealed envelope. He explained that, aware of the strains on the record-keeping system, he had prepared a summary as a safeguard in case the main ledger was damaged. His tone was respectful, and he avoided any hint that he mistrusted his superiors. The inspector opened the envelope, read through the figures, and compared them with the ledger. The matched patterns gave weight to the clerk's concerns. The separate summary made it harder to argue that the irregularities were a late invention. The warrant officer shifted uneasily. The colonel remained composed but more guarded, emphasizing again the pressures of command and the expectation that he keep his men fit to fight. No raised voices sounded in the small hut. The tension showed instead in pauses, in the careful choice of words. The inspection did not end with a dramatic reveal. The team continued its work visiting forward positions, asking cooks, platoon sergeants and ordinary soldiers what their meals had been like over the past weeks. They listened to consistent accounts of rations that were stretched or missing on specific days. Back at higher headquarters, the collected evidence was turned into a report, and its language was restrained. It spoke of irregularities in distribution, insufficient oversight of certain units, and failure to reconcile ration strength with issues. Names rarely appeared. The focus remained on procedures. Inside the division, the consequences were modest but real. Convoys began to leave the depot under closer scrutiny. Truck manifests were checked at more than one point on the route. Reports of lost loads now required detailed explanations, not just brief phrases. At the ledger desk, the clerk noticed that the colonel's battalion no longer appeared as an outlier. Its issues came into line with its reported strength. Other units, previously short, recorded more consistent allocations. Word spread quietly that certain arrangements further back from the front had been disrupted. As some officers were moved to different posts, the colonel received a transfer explained publicly as a need for his experience in another formation. For the men in the trenches, the change appeared in simple ways. Portions became a little more reliable. Hot meals reached them more often, not as a luxury, but as part of the normal rhythm of the day. No one told them that a ledger and a pencil had played a part in that shift. The clerk, however, felt the strain of what he had done. He was summoned to a small office at headquarters, where the divisional quartermaster, the inspector, and a corps representative waited. They asked him to describe in detail how he had kept his separate notes and why he had chosen to present them. He sat straight on the wooden chair, hands folded in his lap, and answered as clearly as he could. And he spoke of seeing the figures diverge from the stories coming back from the line, of feeling that his duty was not only to record, but to ensure that the records reflected reality. He emphasized that he had not altered any official document. The quartermaster reproved him for working outside formal channels. Such independent record-keeping, he said, could be seen as disloyal or as a challenge to authority. The inspector, by contrast, stated that the information had been useful, and that without it, the inquiry might have missed the problem. No promises were made, no clear judgment pronounced. The meeting ended with reminders about proper procedure and the importance of integrity. The clerk left with the feeling that he had walked along a narrow line and that, this time, he had not quite fallen. He continued his work in the ledger hut, and day after day, he sharpened pencils, dried damp pages near the lamp, and checked that each signature matched the right column. He no longer kept a secret notebook, but he did not stop watching for patterns. In quieter moments, he thought about the men whose names he never saw, whose meals depended on the trustworthiness of the forms in front of him. He imagined cold hands lifting lids from field kitchens, wondering if there would be enough for everyone in the queue. The knowledge that his choices had touched that moment stayed with him. When the war finally ended and the division was broken up, the ledger went into storage with many others. Boxes of documents were labelled, stacked and forgotten in archives and warehouses. The clerk returned home, carrying with him only a small discharge book and a few photographs taken far from any front line. In peacetime he found work in civilian offices, where numbers referred to sales, inventories and wages. He sat at other desks under other lamps, listening to different rain on different roofs. The habit of careful record-keeping remained, as did a quiet awareness that behind every entry someone's day grew easier or harder. He did not speak often about the winter in Italy when ration issues did not match ration strengths. If he mentioned the war, he said he had served in supply and paperwork. Most people nodded and assumed his service had been safe and uneventful. Years later, when historians examined surviving quartermaster documents from that theatre, some noticed the brief mention of an internal inspection and minor changes in ration procedures that followed. In staff files, a few lines referred to corrective measures taken after irregularities were found. In medical reports, a trend toward improved nutrition appeared after a certain date. The link between those scattered traces and one clerk's decision to trust his own eyes remained largely invisible. But within the vast machinery that supported armies, his story showed how a single ledger, honestly kept and carefully read, could expose a small protected theft, and how the response, however muted, could restore a measure of fairness to men who had little else to rely on. This channel exists to bring such hidden corners of the war into view, stories of paperwork and principle, yet of quiet decisions made far from the front but felt by those who lived in the mud and cold. For more accounts of the people who held that machinery together and the failures they faced, you're invited to continue exploring with us.